Here's why some flex in your miter saw blade is a good thing, and 4 other tips and tricks to get the most out of your saw. Tip number 1 should be a given, but we're starting with the basics here. Make sure your saw is set up correctly. Use a square or a digital angle finder like this tilt box or one of the ones by Wixie or iGaging that I'll be linking in the description. Zero it out on the miter saw base, attach it to the flat of the blade, and make sure that it comes out at a perfect 90 degrees. Then check that your saw cuts straight when set to 0 by using a square against the fence and the flat of the blade. If it doesn't, you're going to need to look at your user manual to find out how to make adjustments to your saw. Get everything set and locked back into place, and once you're happy, use that piece of wood with a straight edge up against the fence and check that the cut is square. Your saw should be pretty perfect at this point, but one more check I like to do is to set my saw to cut a 45-degree miter and use that same straight piece of wood to make 2 miter cuts. Set those pieces together with a square in between, make sure they're perfectly square, and then look at the joint to see if there's any gaps. If there are, it's time to go back to the user manual and see if there's any available adjustment for its angle detents. Now, I had an old Ryobi miter saw that simply did not have enough adjustment to get my 45s perfect. So it ended up being relegated to being locked in the 0-degree position for just making straight cross cuts. I know you're here to find out why blade flex is good. Stick around because I have some tips for you before we get there. And the second tip is, if you find yourself getting lots of tear out on your miter saw cuts, one of the first things to check is your blade. Most miter saws come with mediocre blades that are best suited to rough cutting construction lumber, not fine woodworking or even trim work. For a 10-inch saw like this Makita, look for a blade with 60 to 80 teeth in a fairly thin curve. I love this 80-tooth CMT Extreme, and I'll leave a link in the description so that you can get one for yourself. Tip 3 is also all about cleaner cuts. Sometimes I have the tendency to use my saw to quickly chop through my parts, but that rarely gives me the best cuts. Instead, try slowing down your cut and, on a sliding saw like mine, avoid sliding forward with the blade at its deepest. I like to hold the saw so the blade sits just below the bottom of the workpiece and slowly push forward. This gives me a cleaner cut on the top of my workpiece, which is especially important when cutting veneered plywood. Now it's almost time to discover how flexing your blade is a key to miter saw accuracy, but first, tip 4 is my final tip for crisper cuts on your saw. The tactic here is creating 0 clearance areas around your workpiece to support the fibers surrounding your cuts. To eliminate tear out on the back, cut a piece of plywood or MDF or even a 1x4 down to size and double stick tape or screw it to the fence on both sides. Most miter saw fences have holes in them for exactly this purpose. Just make sure that you don't use screws so long that they deform or poke out the front of the wood. Run the saw blade through this new sacrificial fence, and you should all but eliminate tear out on the back side of your work. Next, you can either choose to shape a piece of MDF or plywood to replace the cheap adjustable plastic inserts in your miter saw table, or you can hit the easy button like I do.
That was easy.
And order some of this 0 clearance tape from FastCap. What's great about this tape is that it is just thick enough to provide great support for your cut, but thin enough that it doesn't throw off your cut by not allowing your workpiece to sit flat against the bed of the saw. If you happen to make a bevel cut that ends up messing up the 0 clearance support that you cut in the tape, it easily peels off so that you can replace it. Best of all, it's cheap. Here in Canada, Amazon sells a 5-pack for $17.95, which works out to $4 a piece. And for my friends south of the border, you're looking at $9.99 for 5, which is $2 a piece. Honestly, it's a no-brainer. I'll have an Amazon affiliate link in the description for this as well. All right, we're finally here.
Finally!
Now, you may think it's a bad thing to have flex side to side in your saw blade, and in some cases, you're right. If you're making cuts and your blade is shifting around like a spaghetti noodle, your cut won't be straight no matter how hard you try. But with just a little deflection in your blade, you're at the perfect place for the ultimate accuracy in making miter saw cuts. This is tip number 5. Use blade deflection to sneak up on the perfect fit. I do this all the time, whether adjusting the size on a mitered edge to fit perfectly or looking to find the perfect fit between two rails or the side of a cabinet. Instead of shooting for the perfect fit right from the jump, intentionally cut your workpiece a little longer than you think it should be. Now notice here, I said a little longer than it should be. We're talking fractions of inches, not 6 inches or a foot. If you go crazy here, this tip is going to take all day. Once you've made your first cut, check the fit on your workpiece. It should be a bit too big. Now resist the urge to set the blade tooth on your workpiece and just take off what you think that you should. 9 times out of 10, you're going to take too much off. And remember, you can always cut more material away, but once it's gone, you can't put it back. Instead, lower your blade and press your workpiece gently against the side of its teeth. Not the flat of the blade, the teeth. We want just a little bit of flex to be added to the blade as you press against it. Now you're going to hold your workpiece tightly against the miter saw fence and raise your blade. It's going to straighten back out, and when you make your cut, you'll take just a hair's breadth off the end of your piece. Now just go back and forth between your project and the saw until everything fits absolutely perfectly. Yes, it's a little more time consuming, but it saves material, headache, and heartbreak. So there they are, your 5 tips and tricks for miter saw success. Let's review. Get your saw set up square and accurate. Use the right blade. Cut slower and don't cut to the saw's full depth. Create a zero clearance fence and insert. And finally, take advantage of your blade's flexibility to sneak up on the perfect fit. I know these tips have helped make my miter saw one of the most useful tools in my shop, and I'm sure that you'll find the same. But hey, did I miss any miter saw tips or tricks? Drop them in the comments or let me know your thoughts on using a miter saw for fine woodworking. Let's get the discussion going, and listen, until next time, make sawdust, not excuses.